Hey everyone, so today I want to go over the engine and underhood features of the S550 GT500. I want to start off by going around the engine compartment and then getting into the engine itself and going over everything up close and in detail and explaining what all the componentry is under the hood of this car. Now starting from the passenger side, underneath this plastic cover is the battery. You can see the positive and negative cables that come out of it. In front of that is the strut tower. You can see all the various metal reinforcement that they add to this since the coilover is bolted directly to it. So this is under a lot of stress when you're braking and turning, so they add metal here to make sure it stays nice and stiff. This part here is actually part of the chassis itself. Normally on a lot of cars, especially like some of the older Mustangs, this part would be covered by the fender, but the way the S550 chassis is designed, this is exposed. So it's not uncommon to see a little bit of slag, a little bit of pieces of metal on here, because since these cars are machine welded, when they're going down the line, a lot of times sparks are flying, you get little tiny extra pieces of metal land on here, and then they just paint over them. So both of my S550s have that. I have some of that on the other side. You'll see when I make it around to the opposite side of the car. That's not an indication the car's been in an accident. That's just normal with these cars. Here is the main fuse panel under the hood. You can see all the various fuses and solenoids under here. So if you ever have an electrical problem with the car, this is one of the first places you want to look. If you hook a battery tender up to these cars, you don't want to connect it direct to the battery because the battery management system cannot tell if your charger is hooked directly to the battery posts. So I have my positive mounted here, and I have the negative mounted here. So the battery management system can see the current going into the battery, especially when I have the car in storage mode in the winter time. Here you have more connectors, and you have lots of heat insulation under the hood. You're going to notice a very common theme with a lot of heat insulation on everything because this engine generates a tremendous amount of heat. So the air conditioning line, see the plastic cap there that is right next to the exhaust manifold, has heat shielding on it. Same thing with this piece here. This is more heat shielding for the air conditioning system. Just behind that, you have one of the control modules, one of the main ones underneath the hood. Because everything is so tightly squeezed in this hood, they basically had to find a spot for everything. So they basically just put it right next to the engine. You can see all the various connectors for it. Here is the lead for my battery tender. I just leave it there off to the side. The fill for the washer fluid is here. And then you can see more of the air conditioning components here. The top for your recharge, you can see the sensor for it as well. Now on the front of the car, you have this carbon fiber composite core support. This is a structural component that basically helps to tie the front of the car together and hold everything in place. It's going to help to support the radiator, the bumper cover, basically everything that's on the front of the car. All the other coolers that are on the car, the headlights, help to keep the hood firmly in place. So that is a structural component, and they made it out of a carbon fiber composite to help keep the weight down. This is one of the bumpers for the hood to help adjust and set the height of the hood. So if the hood was sitting too high, you would bring it down. If the hood's sitting too low, you bring it up. So you can make sure that the hood is sitting at the same height that the fender sits. Here you have the post for the hood pin. This is a unique style hood pin that Ford designed for this car that all the GT500s have. This is designed to be loose so it can better mate up to the female end of the hood pin and easily line up with that. Some of the later cars, like the GT350s, actually have the same core support with this cutout built into it. They just have nothing here since they use the same componentry on the cars just to keep everything easier. This is a crash sensor, so for the airbag and various safety systems in the car, if you get into an accident, this is the sensor that is designed to detect that should an accident happen. Here you have various pins to help line up the front fascia of the car, and next to it is a bolt. So you can basically push it on, the pins will automatically line up with it, and then you bolt it down and it holds everything in place. Obviously the hood latch in the center has a sensor on it, so if the hood's not down all the way, you're gonna get a notice on your gauge cluster that the hood has not been fully closed. Here is the top support for the radiator. This is not the radiator itself. This piece and this piece are bolted together, and then it basically just the radiator is underneath it and it holds it in place. You can see various rubber isolators here to help cut down on the vibration that goes into the radiator and various coolers on the front of the car. Here's your overflow tank for your coolant and the various lines that run to it. And then, as you would expect, everything is symmetrical on both sides. You have a crash sensor on the other side, your hood pin, your hood bumpers on the other side. Everything is basically the same, symmetrically side to side on the front core support. So here's more of your structural componentry of the car. And like I was saying, you sometimes get a little bit of the slag from welding. When the sparks are flying around the factory, they basically land and weld themselves back on here. And then when they paint the car, they just get painted over. My 350R is the exact same way. Strut tower is the exact same on both sides. Airbox is closed on the GT500s to help keep the intake from getting saturated from heat, from all the heat that this car generates. Here is the overflow bottle for the air to liquid intercooling system. So just like the overflow for the engine cooling, this is for the supercharger intercooler to help pull down those air charge temperatures. Here is your distribution block and ABS pump. You can see these two larger lines that come in here. These come in from the master cylinder. Then they each get distributed to each one of the four brake calipers. And then you can see the cylindrical thing here. This is part of the ABS pump. So if you ever step on the brake and feel that pulsation in your foot, that comes from the ABS pump. Here's your brake booster. You'll see the line where it comes off of the engine in a few minutes. Brake fluid reservoir. And then just below that, obviously, is the master cylinder where those two large lines come from. Now getting into a little bit more into the engine itself. Obviously on the top, one of the most noticeable things is the strut tower brace. This is magnesium. It's obviously bolted to both sides of the strut tower. This is designed to help keep everything really stiff. These were popular years ago as add-ons to cars, but now they're starting to put them on. They have one on my 350R as well, just to help keep everything nice and stiff and keep the chassis from flexing under extreme cornering loads. Now, getting into the engine itself. When you look at this engine, the thing that sticks out the most, obviously, the enormous supercharger, the Eaton twin-screw reverse flow TVS 2650 supercharger, the largest OE supercharger Ford has ever used and the largest TVS supercharger that Eaton makes. This thing eats a tremendous amount of air for an OE supercharger. It has a lot of capacity. It flows a lot of air, which means it needs a lot of fuel to be fed, which means this thing generates, like I said before, a ton of heat under this hood. That's why you're going to see so much heat insulation around the engine and the componentry of this car. This is why I also tell a lot of GT500 owners, keep your rain tray off to let the engine breathe. Unless you're really driving in really bad conditions, which most GT500 owners do not, leave your rain tray off so that your engine can breathe. This is basically a cap. This top piece is a cover for the intercooler underneath it. Obviously, you have the snake up top. There is some sound deadening underneath the snake to help keep the noise down from the supercharging system. You have your plaque that each engine builder signs. There's only one engine builder for each one of the GT500 engines. Under this supercharger is a very large, like I said, a intercooler under it. Here are the lines for that intercooler. You can see this distribution block right here is basically this adapter. Cold air comes in from the front mounted intercooler, hot air goes out to help lower that intake charge. So this is, like I said, a really big supercharger, and it is supposed to be a very durable supercharger. So moving down, you have your heater core hoses on both sides. Here is the line for the brake booster itself. On the top of the engine, obviously you have the throttle body, 92 millimeters, very large for a stock throttle body. You can see the electronic motor here for it, the electrical connector, and you can have some what are likely nylon gears in here to actuate it. You have an intake pressure sensor here on the top of it, and on the very back of the case for the supercharger, you have a MAP sensor. So this engine is monitored with a MAP sensor, a very accurate way to meter the air going into the engine itself. On the passenger side of the engine, you have, on this case, an air oil separator. These are standard for handling package cars and carbon fiber track packs. This is basically your catch can from the factory. Instead of having all that dirty air from the PCV system go back into the engine, it will come out here. It then gets filtered in the air oil separator. Clean air goes back into the engine itself. And then any oil or fuel or any sort of deposits will go back into the top of the head here and go back into the crankcase and get separated out to keep the intake from getting dirty over time. This is nice because this is the first one I've ever seen that is self-emptying, so you never have to go take this apart and empty it yourself. So you have an aluminum cam covers here, sensors for your cam phasers. Here's your oil fill cap, 5W50 oil. Underneath here are going to be your spark plugs and your coil packs. A little bit hard to get to just because there's so much componentry on this engine itself. Here you have the actuator for the bypass. There's a very large bypass valve inside this supercharger. So if you're at very high throttle position and you slam your foot off of the accelerator and that throttle body slams closed, all that boost pressure needs a place to go so it doesn't cause damage. So this would actuate. You can see the little arm down there is actuated by vacuum, and it will open up and allow that air to bypass inside the supercharger. Here is the snout, the drive pulley for the supercharger itself. What is different about this supercharger is this is a front inlet. A lot of the older GT500s and the Terminator Mustangs, they were a rear inlet. Ford decided to go with a front inlet on this, and the air actually comes in from the bottom of the supercharger and then goes through that air to liquid intercooler and when it is brought up, and then around the side of it to go into the runner. So this helps them keep everything nice and compact. It also sets the lobes much lower to give the engine a lower center of gravity. You can see the nice large belt, so this thing has a lot of grip. Now you'll notice that there's quite a bit sticks out here on the front of the snout of the pulley. There's a one-way clutch on the pulleys of the supercharger, which is designed to help with harshness on the supercharger as well as idle, making sure that it smooths out the idle. There have been some issues with clutch failures on these. It's not a widespread issue, but there is a SSM, special service message, out there in the event that one of these were to fail. I'll post my video above of all the GT500 recalls, and there is in the description some information about that if you experience it. Basically what they do is they take the belt off and they spin it. If it free spins both directions, that means the clutch has failed. It should only free spin in the one direction. And then down here you can see all the various pulleys. All the wide pulleys are for the belt that goes for the supercharger. You then also have a secondary set of pulleys for some of the lower demand or lower stress items down there, like the water pump and the alternator. So it's a very small belt down there as well. And you can see that the crank pulley is all metal, nicely machined to be able to handle all the stress from the supercharger. And then just in front of that, this aluminum piece that looks sort of like it's ovalized is actually the housing for the thermostat. You have two separate cylindrical thermostats on this car. They are built into an oval style housing, but it's nice because now you can not only flow a lot of coolant if you need to, but in the event that one of the thermostats fails, you essentially have a backup. So that is what that oval shaped item is. Dual thermostats, dual mechanical thermostats. There you can see the temperature probe on the thermostat housing itself. On here is your inlet temperature sensor. This line right here is a breather line. You'll notice that this is in front of the throttle body. The one on the passenger side that the air oil separator is hooked up to is behind the throttle body. So you'll often hear people refer to that on Ford vehicles, they will get a passenger side mounted air oil separator catch can. That is because the one that is behind the throttle body is always under vacuum. So that's going to get the most amount of basically blow-by coming through it. That's why the passenger side, or the driver's side rather, typically does not get a lot because it's here, it's in front of it, so it's not under nearly as much vacuum as the passenger side is. And here's basically just a little sensor for that. Here is your vapor canister purge solenoid. This is another componentry to the emissions system. Here you can see the fuel lines, the stainless steel of the fuel lines, and just below that, the wiring you can see here for all your coil packs. It's going to be a little bit involved changing spark plugs on these cars. You have to take a few items off. The strut tower brace is probably going to have to come off as well. Some other components, not terrible, but like I said, there's a lot of stuff crammed in here. And behind this plastic piece is a very large fuel rail to keep this engine well fed. And moving down, Here you can see just below the coolant bottle for the intercooler, the backside of the alternator. Again, lots and lots of heat shielding down there to keep everything safe from the heat. You can also see the exhaust manifold. There's basically a shorty style header, so they've gotten away for quite a while now from those old cast manifolds that really didn't flow very well. These shorty style headers flow much better than the older cast manifolds did. So as you can see, there is a ton of stuff crammed into this engine compartment. This is not nearly as open as they used to be. You can see down there, right there, those, you have the fittings at the very bottom for the oil cooler that goes on the front. That comes off where the oil filter housing is, down at the very bottom. And those are pretty much the main components for this engine. So like I said, this engine generates a tremendous amount of heat, so you have a lot of heat insulation around it. And always do yourself a favor and lose the rain tray to help this engine breathe, since it does generate a lot of heat very, very quickly. They did their best to help shed that heat, but this, like I said, you really want to help this car out to be able to breathe as much as possible. So I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.